Okay, we're going to look into how Africa got its name to be Africa now. You know, you look in the old maps and it showed it was called Lybia for a long time, and then how did it change? Well, the Libyan people had a little bit different name for it than other people had for Libya, and that's the simplistic form of it. And it was Afro-Eureka. And so Libya Egyptian, what does that mean? It kind of meant motherland, you know, and it was the land of the Caucasians that lived there and so on. And they named the whole land after that. And after the Punic Wars and stuff, and the winnings of that, they named a man after it. And in turn, from his win there, they named it after that. And of course, the Greeks pretty much named everything, like the Nile and so on. The Nile's original name was the River Ar, but they called it Nilus because that was the name of a river god that they had in their pantheon for that area. In fact, Egypt really didn't go around calling themselves Egypt, but that's another story too. But let's look into this. This is a Home Team History, and usually he's real calmed out and not hopping around like some of these other guys, and tries to be a radio voice. And he also now has decided to become very vague. And as he's vague, I'll try to help add to it. I'm recording it externally because he's too quiet on my regular recording. So let's see if I can do this both at the same time, if we can.
Africa is one of the largest continents in the world. Its inhabitants are believed to have developed the oldest civilizations on the planet.
And by that, he really means the Caucasians of North Africa, and talking about Egypt. And of course, that was always primordial Caucasians and so on. The earliest, what you could call civilizations and so on. But we know now, of course, that Sumeria predates that by quite a bit. We go up into Catalhoyok and stuff, and then now we find a primordial time of way back when, where we have a lot of other things that we found correlating to much earlier times, Proto-Indo-Europeans, and all types of things that happen that encroach onto the last ice age, like Göbekli Tepe. And so we can see really there, and of course, I think the world really realizes the heralds of mankind, and then what they've done since then for this idea that we have in our mind looking at this planet right now was brought to you by Caucasians, figuring out that the world wasn't flat and everything else gone to it. And I don't know if you're aware or not, but they can fly now, and now they've gone up into space and things, and this would be a representation of looking back from space, but just a CGI thing, a computer-generated image of it. Also, the whole concept there brought to you by Caucasians, but let's continue.
So you would think Africans themselves would have had a name for the continent in which they lived. Today,
well, they did. They had a name for it. It was Libya for a long time, and then it became Africa. And these were all the North African people. And you look at Herodotus' old maps, they really didn't even know Sub Saharan Africa existed pretty much, and so on. So let's continue.
We're going to find out how Africa got its name and discover any indigenous name it may have had.
Ooh. Wait. Ooh.
What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and I'm back at it with another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And remember, if you want access to sources, courses, exclusive videos, or if you just want to support the Home Team, you can do so on Patreon.
Sure you could, but then you'd be hearing false things like when he talks about Timbuktu right here and Mali and the great empires there. That was brought about and heralded by Caucasians, and it's well documented. And of course, all the writings they have there at the great libraries and all that stuff. And then we have the idea of Mali, and it was founded by Queen Tinhan, way before any of this went on too. This is a much later type of thing, but he omission isn't guilt, but kind of omission and then being vague is allowing people to believe false thoughts, probably like people really want to believe that they were part of the Egyptians. And of course, his audience is West Africans that came over in the slave trade with the Jewish slave masters that had that Bible that they're not a part of. And they really don't want to be those people anymore, and so they're grasping out at anything, and this has caused a racism by their own hands that they kind of make up and get mad about. Although this guy's not going to get mad. He's just going to tell you where Africa comes from. Let's go.
Sean.com. The link is in the description box below. Numerous scholars over the centuries have attempted to figure out how Africa got its name.
Yeah, they kind of figured it out, too.
The origin of the word Africa, surprisingly, is a very hot topic of debate. There is no universal explanation as to how Africa got its name. With that being said, there are several theories developed by numerous scholars.
Yeah.
First, I'll briefly discuss the most popular theories of today, and then I'll discuss some of the most convincing theories to the origin of the name Africa. One popular...
Well, now, what he's going to do is go all woo and see how that worked for black people. It's really a boon here. At the very end, he's going to try to pull it to Egyptians, and you damn well know it. Yeah, because it's the only thing blacks could attempt to attach to out of that, all of North African things. But the problem is that it's well documented. It always was before. It only became a recent thing where blacks started saying this stuff, and we're like, oh yeah, and they're like, prove it. Like we would have to prove that it was Caucasians as opposed to them that it was Negroids. And whenever you say West African Negroids are saying this, it's actually kind of pathetic. They didn't even know Egypt existed. But let's go. Let's see what he has to say.
The theory is that Africa was named after a European invader that simply named it Africa. But that's an oversimplification and doesn't at all point to its origin. Another popular idea is that the indigenous name of Africa is Alkebulan. This idea is very popular within the black community. The claim is that Alkebulan is the oldest name for Africa, and that in Arabic it means the land of the blacks.
And of course, this would be a black name, but not their even language or not their words. It was imparted upon it, and that would have been from the Islamic slave traders and the Arabics. But so they try to embrace that, but they really can't. And then it really doesn't matter. I don't think Africa is changing its name anytime soon. It's actually named after Caucasians, but let's continue.
This couldn't be accurate because the word for land of the blacks in Arabic is Balad as-Sudan. Unless, of course, they had two names for land of the blacks, which...
Well, they kind of did, because it seems like there were the Sudanese that are way over here, like I'm talking about, over here, way over here, and then there's these people way the hell over here that you have to cross the desert only in certain places to be able to get to, and they're different people, definitely, than each other, so it's possible that they did recognize that and give it that concept. So let's see here. I think I backed it up a hair.
For land of the blacks in Arabic is Balad as-Sudan. Unless, of course, they had two names for land of the blacks, which, if we're honest, doesn't seem to be the case.
Also shows you where Sudanese comes from in the name.
The word Alkebulan means mother of mankind, or even Garden of Eden.
No, it kind of refers to it as a motherland. Yeah, because they knew that there was all these primordial Caucasians that were there and that ran Egypt and did everything, and then they were kind of invading into it, and they were invading into these people's motherland type of thing. It's kind of a concept, but it also, if you look at it linguistically, strangely means that separated place that ain't part of none of this. That place past here that's, it almost comes across as the nothing, or the chaos, the uncivilized, kind of the wilderness. There's a lot of ways you could look at that in a modern way, but I don't know. I think you get the idea of where I'm kind of going with that concept. I think he says something about it. Let's continue.
It's also interesting that the word seems to be of Arabic origin and not African.
Right.
The modern term of Africa that we use today in the Western world almost certainly comes from the Romans, who called their northern African province Africa.
So there we really have it. And so why is it called Africa instead of calling it a boingy? Well, it's because it got named just like Adam in the Bible named everything, and they named that land. And as you can tell, it was these other Caucasians that named Sudanese their name. And a lot of these names are named after that. In fact, Niger, Nigerians, and the whole N word itself, it really just means black. And it's what these other people that had a common linguistic kind of referred to them. But then they also had a river that was called that, and a giant sea. And why'd they call it that? Was it full of black people? Or no, it was just dark. It just meant dark, type of things. And of course, when they run into these black people. So just a little different connotation to it, I guess. But we're not going to take it out of context and try to make it into something stupid in a modern world when it never meant that in elder times. So let's continue.
The term Afri is a Latin term which was largely in reference to all lands south of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
It's been suggested that Afri was in reference to a Libyan tribe in the region.
Yeah.
Later in history, the term Africa began to be used to refer to the whole continent.
Pretty much,
now, even though our modern understanding of the name Africa comes from the Romans themselves still acquired it from somewhere else.
Oh, no.
In other words, the Romans had help. And there's a more ancient word for the continent. According to Leo Africanus, who seems to have the most reliable information concerning the origin of the name Africa, the name evolved from the Arabs and Berbers. According to one theory proposed by Leo Africanus, a man named Africus was a son of a king of Yemen and the conqueror of the Maghreb, or what we know today as North Africa. After he took North Africa, he naturally named it after himself, Africa. However, the Arabs affirm that the name Africa is a corruption of Al-Mafrika, the ancient name of the country beyond the Nile westward.
So now we see that even Yemen had a name that went with it, but their correspondence meant something else. Let's continue.
This word meaning disunited or divided, implying that it was cut off from Asia by the Nile. As mentioned before, the word Africa as we know today came from, or was at least influenced by, Roman interaction.
Right.
Africa as we know it today was first used between the first two Punic Wars and took precedence ever since then.
Well, that's because General Africanus, and therefore that's how it got named after him, and then the Romans kept using it and adopted it as it, rather than it being Libya. And then, due to correspondence and things, Libya still retains the name Libya today, but pretty much the area that they had retained, and not all of it. And all the rest of it got called Africa. Of course, they weren't referring to Sub Saharan Africa at the time. That would be a falsehood if you tried to correlate that.
The question is, though, did any civilization within the continent of Africa call the continent Africa? And the answer is yes.
Yep, there is.
And the meaning behind the word for these people is very interesting.
Oh, very interesting.
It was the Egyptians who first called the continent Africa. The claim is that the word Africa is derived from the Egyptian word Afrika, meaning to turn toward the opening of the Ka. The Ka is a sort of life force of every person, and the opening of the Ka refers to a womb or birthplace. Africa would be, for the Egyptians, the birthplace. According to Gerald Massey, an Egyptologist from the 19th century, he states, "The tongue of Egypt tells us that Africa is the inner land born of, literally, the birthplace." So we have
what we have here is Libya-Egyptian languages, and of course the Libyans are, of course, Caucasians too. And so the concept here that he's trying to propose now is that it has something to do with black people, because he knows a lot of his listeners are black people, hoping that they were the Egyptians or that they were part of the Bible in some way and all these other things when they actually weren't. And it's kind of pathetic, but he just likes to leave it vague here at the end. Now, the tongue of Egypt tells us that Africa is the inner land and born of, literally, the birthplace. And so the idea of the cul-de-sac of running up through the Nile where they were at is to be kind of, in a way, a canal, like referred to as birth canal, of these people. And these primordial people were, of course, Caucasians. They love to show the Sphinx and don't realize the fact that it's simplistic, that the jaw and the bottom would have to be out a little bit more to cantilever and hold the whole weight of the head. But that's not it. You can match that up to Khafre's head quite well. What you can't do is match a West African primitive up to ancient Caucasians in Egypt. Let's continue.
Egyptians themselves telling us that their birthplace was in the inner land of what they called Africa. Is that a coincidence?
No, not at all.
I don't know. But the fact that the Egyptians were the first to call the continent Africa is extraordinary. Now,
so it's extraordinary that the Caucasians name lands, and they've named all of the lands and all of the continents, and we still use those names today, and Ivory Coast and terms that were used, and it's still that way today. Although in America it's quite unique and neat. We actually adopted locals' names into the actual names of the places. Minnesota, Dakota, all of these type of things that people are aware of and stuff. So I think that was kind of neat and special that we did here a little bit more. But it come to find out it's not that unique. For Africa, that they called it, was really what the Egyptians called Lybia, because the Libyans called it Motherland in Libyo-Egyptian, and so it still just means Motherland of the Caucasians, and I think it's going to stay that way.
As for the other theories, they still have their merit, but they all must pay homage to the original. Well, I'm all out, guys. Let me know.
Yeah, he's all out because it's all not about Negroids. In fact, this picture is a little more accurate than you'd like to believe. If you look at the paleness of that person, not some admixed Negro in America that bleaches nowadays or something, and the blonde possibility of hair that's on their head, then you would realize that this is a Caucasian that they've just taken and blown the lips off of and tried to make it somehow look Negroid and mix a Negroid phenotype with a Caucasian there and squinch its nose down a little bit more and make it admixed. The current real hip thing to do is to, now that they know it's all busted and destroyed, still try to claim that there were some Negroids admixed in there somehow at some dynasties, and if that's so, then that means West African primitives were the Egyptian pyramid builders. Well, no, the last of that couldn't mean anything whatsoever. If we figured out that the Egyptians sat on their butt and didn't even know math, but the Nubians somehow did and built them all, still West Africans couldn't ever claim it because they didn't know it existed. And they were primitives. And they're not part of the Bible either. And I'm sad to have to keep telling this to people over and over again, but they keep telling themselves lies about where they come from and even what words mean and where they get the words that they're speaking now come from. For this is the first written language that they ever had. Anyhow, guys, like, share, and subscribe and enjoy, and we'll get on to another one. Peace.